Let's first break down the title of the study. Service provider rapport refers to the enjoyable interaction with the service provider characterized by a personal connection as perceived by the consumers. This study stems from the observation that while tourism produces economic growth for the local communities, the unethical behavior displayed by some tourists is often an alleged source of frustration for the locals. And so the purpose of this paper is to examine the role of service provider as a contextual factor influencing consumers' behavior. So why is it the impact of service provider that we study on ethical behavior? Well, we know that the cognitive process leading to ethical behavior is influenced by both individual and contextual factors. In this case, we will consider that moral identity is the individual factor. And while government intervention is an undeniable contextual factor that enhance ethical behavior intention of the tourists, the purpose of this paper is to examine the role of service provider as a contextual factor shaping consumers' behavior. So part of this research is based on Frederickson's theory, which holds that individual cognition can be broadened by positive emotion. It's called the broaden and build theory and was theorized in 2001. So this research demonstrates that happiness induced by service provider rapport will help tourists to extend their moral identity needed to perform ethical behavior in situations. Within the service context, service provider play an essential role in inducing positive emotions of the customer, such as by showing empathy or expressing positive emotions. Rapport building behavior include attentive, imitative, common grounding, and courteous behavior. Service provider rapport is associated with enjoyment and in the interaction that helps customer feel comfortable, enjoyable, and at ease during service encounters. Thus, it produces happiness to the consumers. So this research is based around three hypotheses that will be tested later. So the first hypothesis is based on the following observation, which is that individuals are more likely to perform ethical behavior when they can extend their cognition beyond their self-interest and consider others. So the first hypothesis that happiness mediates the relationship between service provider rapport and ethical behavior intention of the tourists. Then, individuals with a strong moral identity are more likely to make ethical judgments based on ethical values and behave ethically, which leads to the second hypothesis. Ethical judgment mediates the relationship between moral identity and ethical behavior intention of the tourists. And then we have the third hypothesis, which is explained through the research framework that you can see on the slide, and is basically a view that points out that we have to consider all factors and that both happiness, moral identity, and ethical judgment will mediate the relationship between source provider rapport and ethical behavior intention of the tourists. We will not detail the conduct of the study, but just talk about the results, which are that H1 was verified, H2 that was verified too, and H3, more importantly, was verified. So what are the major findings of this study? So this research confirms that the moral identity of the tourist is not like a static trait. It can be induced by situational aspects, which is then here the service provider rapport. As happiness produced by service provider rapport facilitates abstract thinking, broader mental representations, and attention scope, It could extend the moral consideration and shift the centrality of moral identity of the tourist. Thus, moral identity becomes more central to the tourist, leading to ethical judgment and ethical behavior.
Now we move on to the case analysis and its correlation to some of the ethics theories. And we also trying to connect the implementation of the theory with scenario for ethical judgment in Appendix 2. So the scenario for ethical judgments are, imagine a tourist visiting a tourist object during pandemic, and those tourists only care about their enjoyment in visiting pleasurable places and mostly spend their money on food, entertainment, and hedonic shopping. They are rarely consider the uniqueness of local tourist objects and their features, do not feel obliged to learn native language, courtesy, manners, and other things related to local culture and traditions. They also minimize their interaction with the locals. They refrain from visiting local shops. They do not appreciate help and opinion from the locals. And they do not provide tips to the locals. They do not pay attention to how certain pleasurable activities such as drinking alcohol, sex, vandalism are perceived by the locals. Further, they ignore the effort for energy conservation when they are not in the hotel, litter everywhere, enters the cultural heritage illegally, and pick up natural objects. And so, based on utilitarianism perspective, the benefit for the service providers would be high because of the increase of tourists incoming and use their services, and the benefits for the service provider would also be higher if they could maintain their rapport with the tourist. And for the moral responsibility perspective, tourists has a moral responsibility for maintaining their behavior, for not harming people and breaking a law or rule. For a legal right perspective, can be seen from the Article 406 until 412 of the Criminal Code or KUHP, especially the destruction of goods, is punishable by a sentence of 2 years and 8 months in prison. So according to Article 408, for example, it says that whoever would intentionally and unlawfully destroys, damages, or renders unusable buildings of a railway, tram, telegram, telephone, or electricity, or buildings of gas, water, or pipes used for public purposes shall be punished by a maximum imprisonment of 4 years. So the next is based on negative or positive rights. So tourists have the negative rights to have some privacy and enjoying their time while traveling, but on the other hand, society and people in general also have positive rights to create or maintain a conducive situation in the place where they live. For the last perspective is ethics of care. So the ethics of care is based on human relationship and needs. Ethics of care is the ethical system that defines good as meeting the needs of others and preserving an enriching relationship. So to summarize, the ethics of care approach identifies the needs of all individuals in any ethical situation and attempts to maximize them. So it is different from utilitarianism. However, in that one person cannot be sacrificed for others. Also, there is an attempt to resolve situations through human relationships and a sense that decisions should come from compassion rather than attention to rights or duties. And based on this case, both tourists and service providers should practice to maintain a good relationship. And in this case, it is proven significant that having a good service provider rapport mediated with happiness will affect a more ethical behavior intention of the tourist.